2, everyone. Part 2. You haven't watched part 1 of The Great Siege. Go watch that before part 2. This is part 2. Part 2. Thank you.
Let us return back to this map of the Grand Harbour area. By the July of 1565, even with the relief force that came from Sicily at the behest of the Spanish king and arrived at Burgu and the Fort St. Angelo, well, most of this northern section of this area, this Grand Harbour area, was under Ottoman control. They of course had Tignes Point, which is where they had their encampments, where Dragut Reis was of course shooting his cannons towards Fort St. Elmo. And of course Fort St. Elmo had been lost by the Knights and was under Ottoman control. So now this whole entire peninsula, which Fort St. Elmo sits at the tip of, is now under Ottoman control. The next phase of this siege included trying to take the peninsula of Sengler, as well as dismantling its outward fortification, Fort St. Michael. The reason being is that with the capture of this particular area, the mighty and strong Fort St. Angelo would come under increasing pressure from all four sides, and thus Jean de Valette would either be killed or surrender. The Ottomans could theoretically have travelled around and through the Grand Harbour to get to Sengler, but the ships would come under direct fire from Fort St. Angelo. So on the 15th of July 1565, the Ottomans tried to sneakily surprise attack the Knights of St. John by transporting their ships across this main peninsula to the Grand Harbour and attack Sengler, still using their ships, from this side, completely avoiding the direct fire from Fort St. Angelo. Meanwhile, Mustafa and his land forces would attack Fort St. Michael from the camp at Marsa, which is just south of Fort St. Angelo. This was built as a surprise attack by the Ottoman forces that even Jean de Valette from Fort St. Angelo could not have foreseen from his vantage point. But two things happened which meant that this was both neither a surprise to the Knights of St. John, but also a very devastating miscalculation by the Ottoman forces. Now, despite having transported 100 of their fighting vessels across this major peninsula to cross the Grand Harbour from the north, they were still too close to Fort St. Angelo, if not actually in point-blank range. So out of these 100 ships that were attacking Sengler, only about a tenth would survive the devastation of this cannon fire. The most consequential problem of this attack was that there was an Ottoman soldier who decided to defect from his side towards the Maltese and the Knights of St. John. He pretty much gave the entire game plan of Piali and Mustafa's assault on Sengler. In so doing, Jean de Valette had time to build a bridge, a makeshift bridge crossing Burgu towards Sengler, and thus sending his relief force that had come some 10 days previous to assist the knights that were stationed here and the knights that were stationed at Fort St. Michael and push back the Ottoman fighting ships. But again, there is great possibility that this particular attack would have worked had these fighting ships not been so close to Fort St. Angelo and at point blank range of their cannon fire. They were targeted by 5 cannons that were camouflaged from the Ottomans at the de Gural battery, which had only been constructed at Fort St. Angelo as late as 1547, named after one of the commanders in the Knights of St. John, Chevalier de Gural.
After this devastating miscalculation by the Ottomans, the leadership of Piali and Mustafa decide to just bombard Fort St. Angelo from any direction from which they can. And it is said that this is the most sustained bombardment of cannon fire across the entire siege, and in fact across the entire use of cannon fire in all of history leading up to that point. It was even more intense than the cannon fire that had been sustained at Fort St. Elmo. And of course, previously I'd mentioned that 6,000 cannonballs were shot at Fort St. Elmo in just a single 24-hour period on one occasion. That was devastating. Fort St. Angelo faced even more than that. The only let-up that came for the Knights of St. John facing the Ottoman bombardment was when it rained on the 24th of August 1565. Now, these early cannons and arquebus guns, with their manual loading of gunpowder, don't really work very well in the rain. So they had to switch, the Ottomans and unfortunately the knights themselves, to more rudimentary weapons like crossbows. During this sort of month-long plus of sustained bombardment by the Ottomans, on one occasion, on the 19th of July, one of the gunpowder magazines in Fort St. Angelo exploded, killing up to 10 people, including one of the knights themselves. Then things started to get desperate as we entered into August of 1565. On the 6th of that month, the knights under Jean de Valette decided to take all of their valuables, all of their reliquaries, icons and everything such like, and place them into a tolo, a strong room, which had been built soon after the knights had arrived in Malta in 1530 to 1531. Thankfully, just a day later, the Ottomans blasted through the city walls of Birgu from the south and decided to, of course, attack the major city and the soldiers inside. But then something weird happened. The Ottomans then decided to retreat. And what it was believed, the Ottomans had been given information that a relief force was on its way from Sicily, and so a tactical retreat was probably a good idea. But what had actually happened was that a force that was based at Medina, at the former capital of Malta, had sort of wended its way out of the city and attacked an encampment held by the Ottomans, and also a field hospital. Exaggerations later, this is what was believed to be this so-called relief force. So the Ottomans retreated. And it is probably this accident of retreat that probably saved the Knights of St. John.
With the, as previously mentioned, changing weather conditions of late August, early September 1565, the Ottomans decided to abandon their assault of the Grand Harbour area and make their way towards the old capital of Medina, which, had Mustafa had his way months ago, they would have gone to first. The idea of this was that the Ottomans would take control of the city of Medina, which was poorly defended and with not very well-equipped fortifications, winter in Medina, and then return back to the Grand Harbour in the spring of 1566 for a renewed assault. That was the idea, at least. But the knights and soldiers that were stationed in Medina decided to shoot their cannons as soon as the Ottomans arrived. This is obvious, but what they didn't do was they didn't directly target the Ottomans. They deliberately shot too far range to basically scare the Ottomans away, for the Ottomans to then retreat away. On the 7th of May, 1565, the Grand Soccorso, the Great Relief, arrived at the St. Paul's Bay area of Malta, before making their way towards Nazar, at a defensive position which they would sustain from the 8th of September. Meanwhile, the Ottomans, having left Medina, were on their way back and through the Maltese countryside, where of course they would face off against this relief force. Over the course of the next 6 days leading up to the 13th of September, this relief force, which numbered some 8,000 men from Italy, the Italian states and Spain as well, would pretty much massacre the majority of these land forces under Mustafa. And so, from the 13th of September 1565, the Ottomans left, and the siege was done.
The bells rang out on top of Fort St. Angelo at what is known as the Ferramolina Cavalier, to signify the end of the siege and the victory of the knights and the Maltese people. The cities of Burgu and Sengler were redubbed as the Victorious City, or the Città Vittoriosa, and the Unconquered City, the Città Invicta. But of course, what also comes with a siege like this in 1565 come a lot of casualties and losses. In terms of the Ottomans, some 2/3 of their fighting strength were lost and killed during this great siege, with 50% or nearly 50% of their naval capacity also destroyed. On the flip side, the Knights of St. John and the Maltese people, including the relief forces that came in the July and the September of 1565, only sustained about 2,500 losses. And most of those losses actually came in the assault of Fort St. Elmo during the June of 1565. It is said in the Turkish chronicles of this particular siege that 130,000 cannonballs were shot towards the Knights of St. John and the Maltese people at the various fortifications in the Grand Harbour. Now, most of these cannonballs were then collected and used to infill the reconstruction of these same fortifications, basically used as rubble to build up from the ground. But where there is destruction and suffering, there is also opportunity for renewal and to pay tribute to those that had passed away or killed during this great siege. Like the red poppies that grew on the battlefields of the First World War and has been used as a floral symbol for those that have fought in subsequent wars during the Armistice Day tributes, so too the Knights of St. John and the Maltese people have their own floral tribute to this great siege of 1565. The Knight's Rose supposedly only grows exclusively at Fort St. Angelo or in that surrounding area. It only blooms during the months of May and September, and is also shaped like the 8-pointed star that is very similar to that of the banners of the Knights of St. John. So with this exclusive location, the time in which it blooms, and of course the shape of this Knight's Rose, it has become its own floral tribute to those that had died during this great siege of 1565. And finally, every year on the 8th of September, the Maltese celebrate Victory Day to commemorate the end of not only this great siege in 1565, but also the end of the sieges in 1800 and during the Second World War. This great siege is one of the fixed and significant moments within Maltese history, and considered by some in Europe to be one of the greatest battles from this early modern period. I end this video with a few images of the Vittoriosa Square in Burgu, where there stands a monument to this great siege in 1565. I shall see you in the next video, hopefully, on another one of the sieges or another point of Maltese history. See you later.